In 1831, locating and establishing Zion in preparation for the second coming was one of Joseph Smith's prime objectives. On June 3rd of that same year, Joseph received a revelation that Jackson County, Missouri was the place. Zion would be a gathering place, a place where the saints lived in communal orders and awaited for the imminent coming of the Son of God. The designation of Zion fueled the fires of religious enthusiasm. As Bushman has pointed out, in a moment, Joseph had turned the way station in Missouri into the promised land. Here, the Latter-day Saints would gather into one safe place during the calamities of the last days. The idea that Joseph's flock would build a Zion to usher in the second coming and the millennium was electrifying and highly motivating to his followers. Members of the church sold their homes, gathered in Kirtland as a holding place, and waited until the prophet gave the word that they too could join the saints in Zion, Jackson County, Missouri. But this religious enthusiasm was dampened as time went on. Persecutions began, and the saints were physically forced out of Zion, north to far west Missouri. Eventually, they were driven from Missouri altogether. Joseph even raised an army, Zion's camp, to try to reinstate the saints in Zion, but the attempt failed. Ultimately, their hopes crushed. The saints went on to Nauvoo and then on to the Great Basin in Salt Lake City. After the realization that all that they had been promised had been put on hold, members of the church were downhearted, downcast. Even some of Joseph's closest followers were disillusioned and discontent enough to leave the faith. The expulsion of the saints from Zion and Missouri was a devastating blow. How could the Lord designate Zion, command the saints to gather there, and then allow the saints to fail? Even Joseph was distraught and confused and began to murmur against the Lord. When he asked how long Zion's tribulations would last, he was told by God, "Be still and know that I am God." Bushman observed that considering all of the spiritual experience Joseph had been blessed with, he knew he should not complain. The prophet said, "I am sensible that I ought not to murmur, and do not murmur only in this, that those who are innocent are compelled to suffer for the iniquities of the guilty, and I cannot account for this." Joseph agonized over the bad news from Zion. He said, "It weighs me down. I cannot refrain from tears." By December 1833, however, Joseph received a series of revelations explaining God's purposes. Zion had failed because the saints had broken God's commandments. Selfishness prevailed and made it impossible for them to hold all things in common. There were no shortcuts. Zion could not be built up unless it is by the principles of the law of the celestial kingdom. Otherwise, I cannot receive her unto myself, the Lord said. It was in this maelstrom of disappointment that the saints struggled with three big questions. What is Zion? Where is Zion? And how do we deal with disappointment and unrealized promises?